on Queer Catholic Faith, or QCF. It's great to have you all with us. Tonight, I'm Marianne Derrick, the Executive Director of DignityUSA, and really pleased to welcome everyone tonight. Hopefully everything tonight will go very smoothly, but I just want to give you a few tips for this any meeting gathering. The most common issue that we get is folks saying that the presenters are either too loud or too soft. Please, do your best. Try with the volume controls on your computers or your headphones if you're using them. There are some other great tips here. It really works best to have as few programs running as possible. And if you do have any technical issues that you can't solve just by fiddling with your own computer, at the very bottom on the left side of your screen, you'll see a chat box. And under the Send to Everyone button, you can type anything in there. We have two members of our staff, Logan and Jim, who will try and help you through any difficulties that you're having. If you're seeing people freeze, the presenters freeze, you may need to kind of log out and log back in, but hopefully it won't get to that point for anybody. So hopefully all these warnings will be unnecessary. You'll have a great experience and really enjoy this. For those of you who have joined us for QCF in the past, you know our general format is to have about a half-hour presentation followed by Q&A. Just want to give you a heads up that the question and answer session will probably start a little bit farther into the program, a little bit later in the program than usual, so that Ellen and Derrick and Martine have a good part of this hour to really get into this subject. In the meantime, if you think of something you'd like to have addressed in the Q&A session, or you want to comment on something, use that chat box to put your thoughts down, and we'll make a note of them and make sure that they get brought up during the Q&A session. Okay, you can also use the Q&A box to just comment on things as the session goes on. I'm sure this is going to be very stimulating. Just to get a sense of who all is here tonight, we had a short poll that's just to sort of check out your affiliation. To vote in the poll, which should be popping up on your screen momentarily, you just, there you go ahead and click on the appropriate button. And all the none of the above if there, and it'll automatically tally. Unfortunately, if you're watching in a group, we can only have one answer show, so sorry about that. All right, and I'd also just like to give you a heads up that at the very end of the presentation, you will be sent a survey immediately upon completion of the program. So don't close your browser. It'll take you less than a minute to complete the survey. We really would appreciate it if you would do that, and I'll remind you again at the end of our time together. So for now, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our special guest host for tonight's session, Martine Witchger, who is a member of DignityUSA's Washington, D.C. chapter, and also one of the co-facilitators of our Young Adult Caucus. It's very fitting that he is facilitating our session tonight because the impetus for this session really came out of the Young Adult Caucus retreat that was held in Washington last summer. So Martine, thanks for taking on the hosting duties tonight, and take it away.
Thanks, Marianne. And yes, as Marianne said, I'm Martine. I'm the co-chair of Dignity's Young Adult Caucus. And as well as Marianne said, I just wanted to give you a quick background on how this came to be. We hosted our first ever Young Adult Caucus retreat last summer in Washington, D.C., and we had 40 young adults, part of Dignity and affiliated LGBT Catholics, and our friends join us in D.C. And one of the things when we were talking about what should Dignity Young Adult Caucus do and be in the future, and what are the conversations that need to be had, and diversity and inclusivity and our identities came up. It was a really lively discussion, with one of the biggest breakout sessions. So that was the impetus and for this conversation, but we didn't want to just keep it within our Young Adult Caucus. We wanted to bring it to broader Dignity USA and our allies and elsewhere. So we are glad to have everyone join us. I'd like to just introduce our two speakers, bring them on, and we can start this conversation. We have Derrick Dawson from Chicago. He works at the Chicago Regional Organizing for Anti-Racism. And Ellen Euclide, also from Chicago. She works for Call to Action and does some anti-racism work with them as well. So really excited to have you two here. Thank you so much for taking this time and sharing your thoughts and your work. And I look forward to this conversation. We hope to, just for everyone knows, we hope to, as Mary said, for about 30 minutes or something, have a discussion, and then we'll open it up to questions. But again, if you have any thoughts or go ahead and or questions, put them in the chat box, and we'll hope to address them either in our conversation or later on. And then I just want to turn it over to Derrick. We want to start off with a poem. So go ahead, Derrick.
All right. Good evening, everybody. We want to start with a poem. This poem is by a poet called Audre Lorde. Some of you may be familiar with her. She was an Afro-Caribbean poet who lived from 1934 until 1992. She was a Caribbean-American writer. She was known as a radical feminist and a womanist. She was a lesbian and a civil rights leader and activist. She served as an inspiration to women worldwide, and her identity as a Black lesbian gave her work a novel perspective and put her in a unique position to speak on issues surrounding civil rights, feminism, and oppression. One of the reasons that we wanted to start with this poem was because Audre Lorde, like most of us, claim many identities, and that's what she's speaking about in this poem entitled, again, "There is no hierarchy of oppressions." Ellen, do you want to go ahead and play the poem?
Great. It's such a powerful poem. It's really great to rehear it, and I hope some people were able to hear it. Hopefully, not too many issues. She speaks about the hierarchy of oppressions as well as the multiple identities that we carry. It just brings to me just so much of some of my story and what some of these multiple identities that I carry myself, as a gay man, but also as a Catholic, as I am fair-skinned, white. I blend there, but also I'm Latino. My mom is Cuban, so I'm a Cuban American, and the multiple communities that I belong there. My connection to the land of the Midwest, but also Florida, where I grew up. Just all those identities that we carry. It brings all that to mind. I wonder if Derrick or Alan, you can share a little more what this brings for you and why we chose this as well.
Certainly I can relate. I think like Audre Lorde and as you said, Martine, most of us carry a bunch of different identities. I can also say I carry identity as a African American or Black man, as a gay man, as a Christian, many of those things. And it's definitely a juggling act trying to figure out which one of those are prominent at any given time and under many different circumstances. You kind of have to pick and choose, and in the end, I think it's a question of how to deal with all of them at the same time. And I really like the fact that she talks about hierarchies of oppressions, because I think in our daily lives we tend to want to rank them. Today I'm more Black than gay. Tomorrow I might be more gay than Black, and especially when dealing with relationships with our institutions, churches, family members, lovers, etc. They can take different shapes and forms depending on what's going on at any given time.
Yeah, great. Alan, I think you're muted, or we can't hear you. No, maybe. Can someone else hear Alan? Derrick, can you hear?
I'm not hearing Ellen.
Oh no, we were hearing you earlier. No, we still can't hear you. Well, hopefully she can chime in and we can hear it soon. No, but yeah, Derrick, your words on which identity do we choose, or which we can't, and then as Audrey says, they're all mixed in together. Can you speak a little more like how this could play out in our daily lives and in our communities, and how can we embrace all of our identities and without pinning one against each other, right?
Right, or ourselves against ourselves sometimes.
Yeah.
I think it comes up particularly, I heard you say that this conversation came about in one of your meetings when you were talking about diversity and how to bring more diversity to DignityUSA. And I think it's important because many times one of the reasons we have a difficult time dealing with oppression is because we want to play this hierarchical game where who's oppressed the most? Am I oppressed the most as a gay white male? Am I oppressed the most as a non-white lesbian female? Am I oppressed more as a Catholic or Christian, or am I oppressed more if I'm an atheist, etc.? And sometimes these conversations about who's oppressed more get so complicated that we decide that we don't want to deal with oppression at all and just kind of turn our backs. My particular work is in anti-racism. I'm an anti-racist organizer and trainer. And one of the barriers that we find in dealing and talking about race in particular is that people often have the urge to interrupt the conversation by saying, well, I'm tired of hearing about your oppression. Let's talk about my oppression. And sometimes we have to sort of carve out space to say, as Audre Lorde said, there is no hierarchy of oppressions, and all of the isms need to be dealt with. But today in this conversation, I suggest that we talk about race and racism. And then we can talk about how race and racism intersect with all the other types of oppressions, and how does sexism intersect with sexuality and gender and ableism and all of those things. I am a person who also has a disability, so I know that that the oppression I face on a daily basis because of my disability is a factor, and it's an important factor in my life. I also know that as a person of color, that my disability and oppression around that affects me differently than it might impact a white man or a white woman, etc. And so these things all intersect, and the question is, how can we deal with oppression in a way that honors everybody and all of us and all of our different identities? I think that's a place we have to get to in order to have the conversation and have the conversation be a meaningful conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes. Great.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, I missed part of what you talked about when I was logging back out and in, but I'm sure I agree with all of it.
I think we were primarily, Martina and I were just talking about the meaning of the hierarchy of oppressions and the fact that there is none, and why it's important that we deal with all the different forms of oppression while not letting the conversation scare us and not having conversations at all about oppression. That all of us carry around and claim many different identities, and many of those identities belong to groups that are oppressed. And how can we talk about them and honor each of us without canceling out the conversation by getting into arguments about who's oppressed more? It's difficult for any of us to really talk about who's oppressed more when we may be oppressed in many different ways because we all carry all these different identities. It's not like we are female but not gendered. It's not like we're perhaps living with a disability but don't have a race, don't have a class, don't have a culture. All of these things intersect. And we need to figure out ways to have those conversations that can be inclusive of all of those things.
Yeah, I think that's really important for me as a white person to remind myself of, because it's so easy to pretend that conversation doesn't affect me and to focus on my other identities where I feel oppression. So I try to, on my own, claim my whiteness and see that all of those identities are equal. And I know that's something that we've worked on at Call to Action that's helped bring that conversation into the open and make things, hopefully, a better space for those conversations to happen. So I'm really excited that Dignity is starting to take that on as well. Martina,
Yeah.
you look like you're...
Oh. Well, that is what was great that it came up and at the Young Adult Caucus in our meetings. I mean, knowing that, recognizing that even though we bring diversity of young adults, but realizing we still might be a white-dominated organization, and how can we include more and bring more people in, especially of different races and ethnicities. As we looked around the room and in our Dignity Young Adult retreat, recognizing that. So in addition to having this conversation, like, how do you? Is there more personal work we need to be doing? What can we bring for our communities that we're a part of?
Yeah, I think the personal work is always important, but I think when we're talking, especially from the perspective of DignityUSA, and I am, as you both know, not a member of DignityUSA. I happen to be on the other side as an Episcopalian, but of course have similar issues. But I think that one thing to keep in mind is that if we're talking about diversity, it's very important that we try to focus less on our individual selves and personal prejudices that we probably all carry, and think about the kind of racism that might be embedded in our institutions that keep us sort of segregated. My understanding about DignityUSA, and it's true in my church, I'm sure it's true in the Catholic Church, is that we're all largely separated from each other and trying to figure out, I hear conversations all the time about how can we bring more young people into our church or our group? How can we bring more people of color into our church and our group? And we kind of wring our hands because we all feel that we have tackled largely our individual prejudices, especially as young people, but we still struggle. And I think part of that struggle is because we don't understand or don't recognize that racism sort of operates at an institutional level that doesn't necessarily privilege us as individuals. So we have to think about things like what is in our structures, in our institutions that sort of keep us separated and keep people of color out, or keep people of color in their own churches, in their own communities, and why are we not getting along, especially in a world where things are getting increasingly more diverse, but our institutions often aren't. And so I think if we can't talk about what role race and racism plays in that, and then think about how these other isms and oppressions intersect, I'm not sure that we're going to get very far. So for me, I believe that a conversation, an honest conversation about what in our institutions are keeping us separate, what historical things are keeping us from having these conversations, we're not going to get very far.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of call to action people here too, which is really great. Our two organizations are similar but also distinct, and I'm sure there's a few people here who aren't intimately involved in the leadership of those chapters. So I want to speak a little of our experience at CTA with this work. We've had an anti-racism team that focuses on these questions of looking around the room and seeing who's in the room, who's making decisions, and some of those institutional structures. Who decides who to invite for a speaking presentation, and I think it's only natural we invite whoever we already know, whoever is the books we've read, and that lack of a structure, it seems kind of nice and non-hierarchical, but because we've all been raised in this culture where we are separate from each other, it only reinforces that situation. I know if I don't take stock and look at what books I'm reading, I have a tendency to read authors I've read before, and because of where I was raised, these authors tend to be white. So when I did that little exercise and looked at it, it became apparent what this lack of structures and lack of awareness can be, where colorblindness can actually reinforce those separations. So I think that idea of institutional structures could be something as specific as who's elected to the board, but it can also be taking a step back and looking at how we make decisions. And in some ways, that's really empowering because we have to take that step back and be honest with ourselves for that. So I'm really impressed by some of the things Call to Action has done in that regard, but also we have a long, long way to go to be further. So I'd love to, I see there are some questions coming in, and I know people are eager for specifics, but Martine, where do we want to take this?
No, I really appreciate us thinking about our organizational structures, because I think we all understand this is important work, and we are working on our understanding our identities and our prejudices personally, and working through that. But then how do we bring that to our institutions and recognizing how ingrained and how our institutions function, and how that can perpetuate some of these societal and broader structures, and from there we can move on. So John Noble has a question, bringing in our faith as well, and he says, how do we treat our faith as one of our intersecting identities, and especially as Catholicism. He says, as Catholicism is a largely dominant faith, where does how can we help change that structure, and then adding our LGBTQ identity on top of that, where does that fit in? It's a big one.
Good question. Well, first I would say, although Catholicism is certainly within a structure of privilege in the U.S., it's also a worldwide faith that has such a rich diversity within it, even if we are divided into separate physical spaces around the world. And so I think there's a real something to take advantage of in that when we're talking about who we learn from or who we see as part of our community, and to reach out within our Catholic circles across some of those boundaries. Connecting it to LGBTQ identity, I don't know. I'm still working on that one myself.
Yeah, and I can't speak to Catholicism very much because, again, I am Presbyterian. I have never been a Catholic, but I do know that from the perspective of my church, the church as it operates in the United States anyway is in many ways a microcosm of the rest of culture. And so within any church, within any other institution, you have levels of hierarchy. You have clergy, you have lay people, you have sisters, you have all kinds of levels of structure. And as race and racism play out in society, it also plays out in church like any other institutions. And in my faith, issues of LGBTQ have been played out rather publicly for a long time. We have breakout churches who break away from the Episcopal Church because certain people are more conservative than others, and they don't believe that women should be ordained, for instance. We have schisms because people don't believe that gay men or women should be elected as bishop. And these things play out in particular ways within the church, but it's amazing what the parallel is in our society in general. The same arguments about that we hear going on in Indiana about gay marriage are also going on in the Episcopal Church, and I know in similar ways they're going on in the Catholic Church. And so LGBT issues are intersecting with racial issues. Our churches are having conflicts about African priests. We have a difficult time finding African American priests and clergy people. People are leaving the church because they don't feel welcome necessarily. That's true in churches in general. And a lot of times those reasons are given as being economic or cultural. But if you look at it very closely, a lot of times race has a lot to do with it. And how does race and gender, sexuality, and all those things intersect? So I think it's important to look at the particulars about the Catholic faith, the Episcopal faith, whatever our faith is. But I think it's also important to understand that these issues aren't that separate from what's going on in society in general. And so if we're not dealing with race and racism in society, we're probably not dealing with it in our church either. And it's very easy to find other reasons for things going on because, again, we're colorblind. It's a post-racial society. So race probably doesn't have much to do with anything if we just look at it on the surface. But once you drill down a little bit, we can see that race, racism, class, gender, sexuality, all those things are operating pretty powerfully within the church. And I think one of the issues is, for instance, if we focus on LGBT issues within the church and we don't focus on race and how that intersects, then what we end up with is a flawed analysis. And I think a really good example of that is what happened with, I think it was the Gay Marriage Proposition 9 in California, where the Mormon Church was able to block this passage because the movement for gay marriage completely left out people of color in California. And when it didn't pass, people of color were actually blamed for the measure failing, when the reality was that if the people who were interested in gay and lesbian rights in California and gay marriage had included the voices of people of color in California, the measure would have passed. I think that's a really good example of how race, gender, sexuality, and all those things intersect with our institutions. And if we try to take an activist approach to make change, and we don't find a way to include all of the voices in the community, it's very likely that our efforts will ultimately fail.
Yeah, I think, Derrick, you bring up a good point about the assumptions that sometimes our movements make about whose issue is what. And I think sometimes in the LGBT world, there's assumptions made about people of color as if they're not part of our movements. And I think the same happens to the Catholic Reform movement sometimes. So I think sometimes the first step, if we're talking about how to make our own organizations and our own chapters more diverse, I think we need to check some of these assumptions about whose issue is what and listen to what the real issues of the whole community are, so that we can see those overlaps.
Yeah, I'm thinking of right along these lines, an example from our own Dignity Washington community, the local chapter here in Washington, D.C. Real quick, I think, Derrick, we're having an echo. If you can mute yours, maybe when you're not talking, it might be best. Let's see if that is thanks. So yeah, in local Dignity Washington, we recently, thinking about this intersectionality of different identities, coming from our Dignity Convention 2 years ago, we realized we want to bring more identities and be more inclusive to in our liturgies, and we entered in discernment. Dignity Washington entered in discernment to include women presiders as part of our liturgies, as part of our masses. So we went through a long discussion, monthly discussion meetings of our communities, and for about 8 months, and ultimately decided that we weren't ready for that, but to have women presiders as part of ours for a variety of reasons, but we did recognize the lack of women's voices in our community, as we are a dominantly male community, and the lack of diverse voices in general, and needing to look at our institutional structure and see if we can be better at bringing different people into our community. So it wasn't so much as I think there was discussion on, is this our issue? Is women's issues, is bringing women into our church? Aren't we just an LGBT organization? So there's always that conflict and that discussion to be had, and I think it's important to recognize as Audre Lorde said, no hierarchy of oppression, that we're like, sometimes we're participating our own or not when we're not including those, we're also participating in our own oppressions. That an interesting part of our experience of dignity, and I'm sure a lot of chapters are going through, and communities are going through similar things.
Yeah, sometimes it's important to think about diversity. Have you ever seen some of the morning talk shows on Sunday mornings where you have a panel of 5 white straight guys talking about what do women think, and what do black people think, what do Latinos think? And you look at it like, well, maybe you should ask one of them, or have a woman on the panel. We get into these cycles where we don't recognize that we get together because we all have similarities, and then we end up being 5 straight people talking about gay issues, gay and lesbian issues, and we don't understand why that is. Sometimes we have to sort of be very intentional about asking people who are outside of our own identities, what do they think and what are we doing wrong? Sometimes we need to say, if our circumstances are that we're a bunch of straight men or even gay men sitting around the table, then maybe what we can do is find ways to be intentional about asking women to show up and asking what they think, asking what we're doing wrong, what we're missing from their perspective. And I think that's true if it's a people of color group, if it's an all-female group. I think we all fall into that because our culture pushes us in that direction. And the only way we're going to break out of it is if we find intentional ways to think outside of ourselves and be intentional about requesting other perspectives.
Yeah, we're definitely working at reaching out to the women that are in part of our communities and seeing what, and like, you know, what, yeah, speaking to them and hearing their perspective on how they feel about the community and how we can better be more welcoming. Yeah.
Dignity has also, and CTA has also kind of made a similar step in reaching out directly to young adults and sort of lifting up those voices even though they're the minority in the community. And I think we can look to that as an example of how we can be similarly intentional about prioritizing the voices of other minorities in our groups.
Definitely. That's an excellent example. And I guess I might be a fruit of that.
And it can be difficult to do because one thing that you have to keep in mind is that the voices of people who have been traditionally oppressed and locked out are not always eager to join in because people have felt that they've been disregarded and dismissed for so long that they often absent themselves. And then the dominant group feels like, well, they're not interested in us. They have nothing to contribute. They don't like us. When the reality is that people have been pushed out for so long, they just don't feel that there's a space for them. And that's why the intentionality and some honesty is very important. Sometimes you have to say, we recognize that we have not been very inclusive and not been intentional about including your voice. We want you here because we really do need to hear what you have to say and hear your perspective. A lot of times we say everyone is welcome, and then when people don't automatically show up, we get resentful and feel like they're not interested in participating. And a lot of times we have to understand that we have to go an extra distance to compensate for the amount of exclusivity we perhaps unintentionally exhibited in the past.
Oh, Ellen, I don't think we can hear you again. Oh no, again, I don't think you're showing. But gonna respond to Derrick. And I think definitely it's a long road, right? Like we can't just give up right away in doing one step. I think that it's an all are welcome is a start. I think Dignity Washington's experience of wanting opening the question up and then doing some self-reflection, and we can't stop here. We have to continue and continue these conversations and continue to create the spaces to and work hard and be authentic in reaching out and saying that we need these voices and we want you as part of our we want to be better. Marianne brings up an interesting point or a question about we talk about safe spaces or establishing places to have good, safe conversations about race and privilege and racism, which is this concept of brave spaces, which I've not even heard of, but recognizing there's a lot of risk in this vulnerability. And have you heard of this space, brave spaces, Derrick? And can you speak more about that? Oh, you're on mute, Derrick.
Can you guys hear me now?
And I think we can hear you now, Ellen. Yeah. I just asked Derrick about brave spaces.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm familiar with it. We talk about it in terms of brave spaces because a lot of talk today is about microaggressions and harmful things, and because most of us have had conversations about race and racism that have not gone very well, and because many of us are sensitive either in what we say or what we hear, it can be very difficult to have those conversations. So I think one thing that's helpful, if you heard about Starbucks race campaign that happened in disappeared pretty recently. I think that's a really good example of trying to have conversations that can be very difficult and very nuanced in ways that aren't very helpful. And so one way that you can have these conversations in a way that's safe is set up some ground rules and acknowledge the fact that these are difficult conversations. We often recommend that if an organization is not used to having these conversations, that they be had with a moderator and very, very concrete ground rules. In our workshops, for instance, we have a community agreement that we ask everyone in the space to agree to before we have the conversation, and then refer back to that agreement during the conversation, so that we ask people to be very intentional about respecting everyone's dignity, for instance, about understanding that everyone is on a journey and everybody is learning at the same time, and things like that, so that there's a container around the conversation that allows people to be able to speak freely and honestly while also respecting everybody in the room. And there are things like that that you can do to create a space, and not just assume that you can have these conversations that are open and honest, that have been barred from our lives for so long, and then expect people to just sort of jump into these conversations. There are too many delicate things, there are too many things we don't understand about each other to jump into those conversations without some kind of very intentional preparation.
Definitely. Wow. Yeah.
I think that's one thing. I think that's one thing also goes back toward that intentionality being not just tokenizing. I think probably a lot of us here in this virtual room can relate to people assuming we know everything about gay rights just because we're queer. And we don't always want to talk about it. We don't always feel like experts on it. And I think the same is true of all identities. And so creating that intentional space so that people can come to that conversation knowing that they're going to be talking about that, instead of just someone assuming that they're an expert because they're what they look like, is a good first step too.
Yeah, and I think also having those conversations where you can have a basic understanding and an assumption that everyone is doing the best they can, and everyone is trying to respect each other's dignity. If that can be set up beforehand, then it makes it a lot easier to hear things that you disagree with, or hear things that you may feel are absurd, understanding that everyone is not in the same place and everyone does not have the same understanding. The conversation can go much, much further that way if that can be taken care of ahead of time.
Yeah. Our call to action chapter in Maryland has been having some really amazing listening circles, I think they're calling them. And they did this, as I understand it, different topics for different years. So last year they really focused on learning from each other about LGBT issues. And this year and the LGBT Catholic experience. And this year, as I understand it, they're really focusing on understanding the experience of non-white Catholics. And they've been really great about bringing people in to hear, but also to have a dialogue and not always just sort of the expert speaker panel sort of relationship. I'm sure there's very likely someone on this webinar from that chapter if they want to chime in the chat box. But if there's not, feel free to get in touch with me or with our chapter leader there for ideas, because I really want to lift up what they're doing on the topic.
And did you say, Ellen, that they're, like, over the last year they did LGBT, Catholic-ish, and then non-white, like over a year? Is that what it was?
Yeah.
That's,
so
I love that.
And then next year I think they're doing sort of what is the women Catholic experience, so not what are their issues exactly, but what is that experience like, and sharing that around the table, which I think is really beautiful. I'd love to see it in more places.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, it's definitely thinking of the long view. Spending a full year, several meetings, several gatherings, several listening circles, if they're calling that, and really not just, saying one and done, kind of, and like continuing on.
Right.
but
right.
I guess I'm just using that basketball term, which I must have learned in March Madness recently. But yeah, we're not just done with this conversation here with Dignity, with our, our communities. We're not. That's really amazing to hear what Maryland, the call to action.
Yeah, I think it's, Ellen, what you're talking about is so important, because if we don't hear other people's experiences, then we really don't have an opportunity to understand each other. And also, if we don't hear other people's experiences, it becomes very, very easy to live into the assumption that my experience is universal, that every Catholic woman has the same experience, because there is a thing called dominant culture. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we don't understand that dominance causes everyone to either try to fit into that narrative or to see ourselves permanently outside of that narrative. And that will also prevent us from making progress. Once we start hearing about other people's experiences, then things like empathy become much more important. And then inclusiveness becomes much easier after that. But we have to first acknowledge that there's certain power dynamics at play, and if I am not honest and clear about that, then if I am a white straight male, for instance, I don't necessarily understand that my position and privilege is dominant and causes certain reactions to anybody who doesn't fit in there. So it becomes very important to sort of have a wide understanding. We all have privilege in a certain way. I am an African-American male, and I can claim my oppression, but I also have to be very clear that as a male in the United States who speaks English, who has a certain education, I have a great deal of privilege that I carry with me, and that has meaning to people around me. And we all need to keep that perspective in mind. And if we don't talk to each other in a very honest, open way, we will never come to that understanding, and we will never be able to diversify our institutions. And 10 years from now, we'll still be saying, why are we all a monolithic group in our Dignity chapter, in our church, in our whatever our environment is?
Mm-hmm.
We have a few more minutes, I think, and I this has been a really amazing conversation. I just wanted to ask this question, of course, this is hard work, right? Can we just acknowledge this is hard? And I think that, it's sometimes easy to talk about them, but not to acknowledge, and I think it's good for us, lean, right? But we know it's necessary work, right? And it's, as we said, you can't just have one conversation about it. We continue over and over again, and we'll mess up and we'll make mistakes, and right, but it is hard. And how do you keep, you both have been doing this work for a while, right? How do you stay with, or what keeps you going, or maybe also what gives you hope, or and with that kind of question.
Heather? Inspire me, Heather. Inspire me.
Well, this is work that I really love, and I think all of us who stick with this church of ours can understand something about what it means to look at a system that is oppressive and see some hope there, and see what the opportunity is, and where the beautiful people are, and where the community is. And as someone who really cares about community and creating community, I see this anti-racism work as the absolute foundation of that. I don't think I can have a healthy community without recognizing the systems that are keeping some people out. My work has mostly focused on systems that keep people out by racism, but there's also clearly systems that keep people out because of their ability or their gender, or all those things we're good at analyzing. So just having met amazing people and focusing on creating that kingdom here on earth, as we say in our Catholic speak, is really just so integral to my own faith and my own vision.
Yeah. Thanks.
it's hard for me to answer the question concisely, but I can say
4 minutes.
Okay. I would only say that, as an African American who grew up on the south side of Chicago, I've had some pretty horrific experiences around race, and most of them I found were the kinds of experiences that accumulate over time and cause nothing but pain and hardship and anger. And when I was first introduced to the concept of anti-racism and institutional racism about 15 years ago, it really did change my life. And I have a fundamental understanding and belief that we are made to live in community, that we are not made to live alone, and we thrive in community, and that's how we're supposed to be. But I also have an understanding that the only way we can really live in community is by living in authenticity and having authentic relationships. And I don't believe that we can have authentic relationships with each other if we don't understand the impact of race and racism on us as individuals and a culture. And so for me, the only way to get at the dignity of any human being and all human beings is to move towards having more authentic relationships. And I think racism and living an anti-oppressive life is the only way to get at that. And that's why I still do this work. I find it life-giving, and I find it absolutely necessary in order to live fully.
Yes, it's all to live more authentically and to build this kingdom of stronger community here on earth. That's really great questions. I guess, from my experience as well, I think I had a couple of years ago, actually was living in an intentional community with a couple other postgraduate volunteers that with a white woman and a Latina woman, and it was through discussions and mess ups and microaggressions and talking really real with each other, be like, this is how this and we were, and part of our program too was doing some anti-racism trainings and getting some of the vocabulary for this and really understanding the root of our society, as well as in the past and what's in our own families and our lives and where white privilege comes from. So I'm newer to this work, but I know I try to keep it more at the top of mind. But it is the search for authentic and stronger communities. I think it drives us all to continue this work and as Catholics and Christians to bring that kingdom of God on earth, as Ellen said. I think is really should hopefully sustain us.
Yeah, I think we often think about racism in terms of what it does to people of color. But I think the reality is that racism dehumanizes all of us. And the only way to regain our humanity is by doing anti-racism work. And I believe that firmly. Yeah. We're all damaged and harmed in immeasurable ways by racism, whether people of color, whether we're white, whether we're gay, whether we're lesbian, whether we're transgender, whether we have disabilities, whatever it is, racism dehumanizes us, and that's been true from years before the invention of the United States of America. And all we have to do is think about what has happened to Native Americans, what has happened to Latinos, to Asians, to all people of color in this country, and the effect it has had on white people, to understand that we're all dehumanized by it. And we need to do whatever we can to regain our humanity.
Yeah. It's a great way to end right there. Any last other closing words or thoughts? Or Marianne will close this.
Martine, that was exactly what I was thinking. I think, I mean, as a community rooted in Catholicism, any place where the body of Christ is broken is damaging, and our work is about bringing healing, bringing unity back to that body of Christ. And I feel like this conversation was such an important partaking of communion in that spirit. So obviously there is so much more to be done, but this was really important. I think the issues of hearing one another, of honoring experience, of the storytelling, and as Amy put it, the deep listening, the importance of empathy, the importance of inclusion, and really seeking to be one in Christ and across the lines of faith even is just so important. So thank you for a deeply, deeply spiritual and meaningful and important conversation tonight. It was really good, and I hope that for all of us it will inspire some of those brave conversations that are needed, as well as a continuation of this work in all of the various circles in which we move. So thank you so much to all of you, Derrick, Ellen, Martine, and also to Jim, to Logan, and to Peggy for supporting the technical side of our conversation tonight. And thanks again to all of you for joining us. Please, again, as you don't sign off, when this closes down, you will immediately get that survey. We really appreciate your feedback. We take it seriously. A couple of other quick reminders. For those of you interested in attending the DignityUSA convention in Seattle, July 2nd through 5th, where Ellen will be one of our speakers, along with another great lineup, I just want to remind you that April 15th is the deadline for early registration. So please save yourself some money and use that money and registration you'd save to get lots of souvenirs or to go on one of the great field trips. Please sign up for the convention. And please join us for our next QCF session, which will be held on May 19th. And you'll get to meet 3 of the families who are going to be part of the Equally Blessed pilgrimage to the World Meeting of Families in September, representing a whole variety of LGBTQ families and our loved ones. So sign up for that if you haven't done so already. Again, thank you to everybody for your participation, to our speakers for sharing their wisdom so beautifully, and please give us your feedback. Good night, everybody, and have a blessed continuation of the Easter season.
Good night. Thank you.